Tuesday morning, 9:06.
I presented Australia's case for an exemption, and we agreed on wording to say publicly, which is that the US President agreed that an exemption was under consideration in the interests of both of our countries.
Tuesday morning, 9:58.
It's a big deal. It's a big deal. This is the beginning of making America rich again. It's 25% without exceptions or exemptions, and that's all countries, no matter where it comes from.
At 9:07,
I said to President Trump that this was an issue of some media coverage in Australia.
and about an hour later,
I just spoke to him, very fine man, and he has a surplus. I mean, we have a surplus with Australia, one of the few. And the reason is they buy a lot of airplanes. I told him that that's something that we will give great consideration to.
possibly not for the last time, Australia and our Prime Minister found themselves at the very heart of the Trump presidential maelstrom this morning. It may not have been a lot of certainty in an uncertain world, but it was at least something for a PM facing yet another issue on which the opposition is claiming Australia's interests are being harmed by bad judgments and weakness from the PM, including Anthony Albanese's past criticisms of Donald Trump.
There are consequences for that. Now, I can't apologise for comments that the Prime Minister's previously made that now damage the relationship. That's an issue for the Prime Minister to address.
Peter Dutton told reporters it was important for the Trump administration to hear that there is a bipartisan position on the question of ensuring Australia is not hit by tariffs by its close ally. But while both sides of politics may agree on tariffs, the Parliament has watched a bitter and particularly ugly division play out in the past 24 hours.
My question is to the Attorney-General.
Susan Lee wanted to know why hate crime laws passed last week included mandatory sentencing provisions, demanded by the opposition, when this contradicted Attorney-General Mark Dreyfus's long-term opposition to mandatory sentencing.
Having been steamrolled by the Prime Minister on a bill that passed the House last week, can the Attorney-General please detail the benefits of mandatory sentencing, which he now strongly supports?
Underlying the question to the country's most senior Jewish politician was the coalition's ongoing charge that the government has been too slow and too weak in combating anti-Semitism.
No government has done more to combat the abhorrent and shocking rise in anti-Semitism than this government. The Liberals talk about it, and this government acts.
The Attorney-General then took his answer into an emotional charge against the coalition, prompting an extraordinary turn of parliamentary events.
In the past few months, I've stood in the shadow of the main gate at the Auschwitz death camp. I've stood on the field where a music festival in Israel was turned into a bloodbath, and I've stood in the ruins of a burnt-out synagogue in my hometown. But those opposite have taken every opportunity since the 7th of October 2023 to politicise the trauma and the experiences of the Jewish people. I do not need the Leader of the Opposition or any of those opposite to tell me what anti-Semitism is or how seriously I should take it. You're disgusting.
The manager is entitled on his feet. I'll give him the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I move the member be no longer heard.
Using the gag, as it is known, is exceptionally rare during question time. It's only been used 4 times during this parliament, but only once during the previous parliament. The tactic and the context provoked genuine shock in the parliament. When the gag motion failed, the opposition unsuccessfully demanded that Mr Dreyfus withdraw his remarks.
There's nothing more serious than the opposition being accused of politicising an issue like this.
The Speaker ruled he did not have to withdraw.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm the son and the grandson of a Holocaust survivor. I went to the commemoration of the liberation of the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, a place where 1 million Jews were murdered, a place where my great-grandmother was murdered on the 13th of October 1942. And I say to members of this House that we've had a wave of anti-Semitism in this country, and right now what we need is unity. We need bipartisanship, and that's the effort that our government made
The Attorney
with the
General's
bill that
time
was passed by
has
this parliament last
concluded.
week.
This morning, the opposition leader doubled down in his attack on the Attorney-General.
The claim yesterday by somebody who's been largely absent from the public debate on anti-Semitism over the last 15 months that somehow the coalition's politicising the issue of anti-Semitism is a disgraceful slur. He, I think, apologised to the Prime Minister on the front bench afterwards, and so he should.
That is, Peter Dutton stated Mark Dreyfus had apologised to the Prime Minister for slurring the opposition. In a statement shortly afterwards, Mr Dreyfus said Mr Dutton's claims were a complete fabrication.
I never thought I'd see the day when a Liberal leader would try to silence a Jew for speaking about anti-Semitism in the Australian Parliament. I stand by everything I said yesterday.
President Trump is in a hurry and better prepared this time round to enact the policies that matter most to him. Tariffs are, of course, near the top of the list. It may be harder this time to evade the penalties on Australian steel and aluminium that Trump wanted to level against Australia in his first term. The Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister, Richard Marles, was in Washington on the weekend, and he joins me now. Defence Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, welcome to the programme.
Thanks, Sarah. Good to talk to you.
Now, this morning, the Prime Minister said his phone call with President Trump went well, but the language of the President's executive order that we've seen since, and from senior figures in the White House, is very critical of Australia. Is anyone in the administration going to be on our side during this debate?
Well, I think we take what both the Prime Minister and the President have said at face value in terms of the conversation that they had this morning, and both of them have made clear that Australian exemptions from the tariffs that have been put in place is under active consideration. I mean, that's not said lightly, and it was said by the President in his media statement, as it was said by our Prime Minister, and as they both made clear, that was what they talked about. That was the agreement that they reached in their conversation this morning, which, having spoken with the Prime Minister myself, he said was, very positive, very constructive, and we'll obviously now work diligently to put forward our case for those exemptions to apply.
At the same time, there were people today, including the President, talking about there being no exemptions. They went further. They accused Australia of disregarding commitments to restrain our aluminium exports. First of all, on that, are those allegations accurate?
Well, I mean, I can't speak for the former government in terms of what it did or didn't do, the former Australian government. That's really a matter for them to explain. But again, I come back to the point that I understand the words that you're quoting from, but in the discussion that was had today, in the President's own press conference, having signed the executive order, he made clear that Australian exemptions to this order would be under active consideration. And that's where this is now at. And as I say, we will now be taking this moment to make our case to the US administration about why those exemptions should apply, because it is good for both Australia and the United States that they do.
Now, the Prime Minister said about his phone call with President Trump that he talked about Australia's potential to supply critical minerals to the US. Was that raised as leverage?
No, I think the opportunity to provide critical minerals to the United States has actually been something that has been talked about over a long period of time. This is an agenda that we have been pursuing with the previous American administration, that we've now sought to pursue with the Trump administration. I mean, the fact of the matter is that Australia does have an abundant supply of rare earths, of critical minerals. There is an ability to put in place a supply chain coming from Australia, which is an attractive proposition, and it makes sense that we can do this with the United States, and I think there is interest under the Trump administration to walk down this path.
Well, let me ask you that then. If that wasn't raised as leverage, what leverage do you have?
Well, ultimately, this is a matter of what is a good deal, if we want to think about it in that paradigm. I mean, Australia in its trading relationship with America is one where America has a trade surplus. We do roughly just over $100 billion of trade every year, and it's about 2 to 1 in favour of the United States. In that sense, having that trade in a manner which is tariff-free is very much in the interests of both countries, but very much in the interests of the United States. As the President has pointed out, we are one of the few countries which has a trading relationship with America in those terms. So I don't think it is a good deal to move down a pathway of not having tariffs in place in respect of the trade which exists between our two countries. And to the extent that we are exporting into the United States, that is supporting American jobs. Now, that is the case that we have been making and will continue to make to the US administration. And ultimately, I think if there's anything that's been shown by the Trump administration, they are clearly going to act in America's interest, and it's America's interest to walk down the path of having the exemption of these tariffs apply to Australia.
Now, Australia made the first of 6 payments, nearly $800 million to the US recently as part of the AUKUS deal to bolster American shipbuilding capacity. Should we hold any subsequent payments until we get a tariff deal?
Well, we will walk down the path of pursuing the AUKUS arrangement as we have been. We announced an optimal pathway in March of 2023.
If I could just bring you back to the question, do you see a potential for future payments to America to be linked to a deal on the tariffs?
Well, I'm trying to answer the question. I mean, we have been pursuing the optimal pathway from the moment that we have announced it. Back then, we announced that there would be payments by Australia to provide for the American industrial base to increase the production rates and the sustainment rates of American Virginia-class submarines. We need that to occur in order for the transfer of the Virginias to happen to Australia. So we are making the payment into the American industrial base in order to create the availability of American Virginias to come to Australia, and we need that capability. The optimal pathway stands on its own terms. The reason that we are making the payments into the American system is what I have described, and we will continue to do them because that is what is in Australia's interest.
Now, the Prime Minister has announced a meeting of senior Australian representatives in Washington on February the 25th, I think is the date, with senior US representatives present. Who will attend that meeting and what's the purpose?
Well, look, that is a matter still to be worked through. But we want to make sure that we are doing everything we can to advance the broad range of interests that we have with the United States.
So it's not about the tariffs, that particular meeting?
Well, it is about pursuing all the agendas that we have with the Trump administration. I think the point I would want to make is that we want to maintain a sense of momentum that we have in the way in which we have been engaging with the Trump administration. You know, I was the first defence minister around the world to meet with Secretary Hegseth. Penny Wong was the second foreign minister to meet with Secretary Rubio. Of course, we've now just had the second conversation between President Trump and Prime Minister Albanese. In fact, we really have hit the ground running in the way in which we are engaging with the Trump administration, and we want to continue the momentum on that across all the equities that we have in our relationship with the United States.
Now, Peter Dutton said this morning that if the tariffs go ahead, they will damage the relationship. Do you agree?
Well, let's work on pursuing the exemptions that we are seeking. Let's take the fact that the United States President has agreed to give active consideration to an exemption in relation to Australia, that he acknowledged today in his statements that it is a trading relationship where America has the surplus, and that is a basis upon which we can move forward. And really, we need to be focused on pursuing that, and I am confident that we will be able to pursue a productive relationship between Australia and America under the Trump administration.
Richard Marles, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thanks, Sarah.